This is the Spirit and Wellness Show. News and information from a higher perspective. Your host, Harry Wilkinson. And hello, and welcome to the Spirit and Wellness Show. This is the show where we look at the days and weeks events, talk about happenings in the world of politics, science, just about anything else that's happening out there that we interact with via the media or via our new media or in any other way. And we take a step back and we look at it from a higher perspective. So those of you who've listened for a while, you know what I mean by higher perspective. It's what some people might call a metaphysical perspective, a spiritual perspective. Basically, it's based on, it's the viewpoint of looking at the stories that are out there that we're interacting with as reflections of our highest state of consciousness. That's the best way that I can put it in a thumbnail version. And so when you take a look at things in the news media or in the world around you, and you recognize yourself in them, and you recognize that at the highest level of your consciousness, of your existence, that this is something you've created in sort of an entangled way with other minds, but since all minds are essentially one, it's you. And you've created it for a variety of reasons, most of which are experiential. In other words, to experience various ways of thinking, feeling, ways of experiencing in much the same way as, well, you go to the movies or you get involved in a video game or now virtual reality game in which you immerse yourself in a world that is not real for all intents and purposes, and you become a character that has strengths and weaknesses, and you play a game using those strengths and weaknesses. And through that game, you experience, maybe you learn a bit, maybe you just have fun or a thrill experiencing something that you wouldn't experience in your regular everyday life. Well, it's much the same concept then. The idea that we, in this mundane existence that we have, it is sort of a virtual reality game that we're creating at a much higher level. And this is not new stuff. I mean, you've heard everything from the movie The Matrix to lots of pop psychology and science fiction books talk about this sort of thing. And it is an old metaphysical perspective on things. So for me, it's helpful to use it as a focus to really get into what might otherwise be very troubling, stories in the world. I mean, take a look around. People are panicking. People are terrified of one particular presidential candidate possibly getting into the White House. And all sorts of nightmare scenarios are being, floated about around this person whom we all know. I'm of course talking about Donald Trump, but actually there's people who think that way about Hillary Clinton too. So I should probably include that as well. It's a kind of thing where, when you panic or when you delude yourself in these fear scenarios, you block yourself from actually really getting to what's going on and what's being created. And if you can go into it and recognize it and recognize yourself in it, what happens is you get to take energy back from that creation. And once you take energy back from a creation, you change it. Now you don't go into it with the intent of changing it or making any changes at all. You just go into it to get to the heart of whatever it's triggering in you. Let's say there's a story in the news, like I said, I mentioned Donald Trump, so maybe Donald Trump worries you a lot. And so you go into that energy, when you hear a story about him, and you feel that energy rising up, and you let it go, basically. Then you go into it, and then you look at it and recognize yourself in it. If you can get to yourself and say that this is something that we've created on a much higher level, and it's something that we are wanting to experience, and it's an amazing, this amazing creation that we've this amazing illusion that we played. This amazing game or trick that we've played on ourselves to make us believe that we're as fragile and apocalyptic and nihilistic as as we're pretending to be in this game of life. So there's a lot to be gained from that approach, and that's what I try to do on this show. And the transition era. Well, the transition era is something that I've talked about quite a bit. Again, if you're familiar with the show, basically, the transition era is this era that we are living in now, where there's been sort of a convergence of technology, scientific breakthroughs, particularly some of which we're going to talk about today, particularly in the world of physics and the scientific worldview, which is changing from one of an atomistic point of view, where everything is sort of rigidly defined and very individualistic, and works together like a pieces in a puzzle or pieces in a clock, to a holistic perspective where everything influences everything else. You've heard the whole butterfly effect concept, where something happens and a butterfly gets caught in Africa, and it affects what happens over here. Well, that interconnectedness is the new model that's emerging in science. So it's a convergence of that technology and a burgeoning awareness, a consciousness, and an awareness of who and what we are. Basically, all these things are coming together to put us in a transition era. So what's happening is that we're seeing amazing changes, some of which are, still in the works, hidden or underneath, some of which are going into this back and forth process of a couple steps forward, a couple steps back, and some of which are happening very quickly. An example of that, as I've mentioned several times on this show, is the acceptance of gay marriage after decades of refusal to accept that as being legitimate marriage. All of a sudden, you hit the tipping point, and it's not a problem anymore. Well, that's kind of the way that it is with all of these things. It's a combination of awareness and I guess, evolving is a way to put it. But in any case, we are right in the midst of amazing social changes that are happening, and some of them are happening overnight, as I mentioned, and some are going to take some time. But I've been focusing pretty exclusively on aspects of the transition era on this show for, I guess, probably a year or more. But I think I'm feeling that this will probably be the last show for a while where I talk about the transition era. I think going to change the focus slightly on some issues, particularly some of the wellness issues that are important and don't sometimes don't get a lot of time on the show just because there's often so much to talk about in our world that I sometimes am not able to get to the wellness portion of the show in the way that I'd like to. So I'm thinking that maybe we'll change that up for a while, come back to it later. But for today's show, we are going to talk about, and I've talked about this before, by the way, spirituality, science, and the transition era. So, by spirituality, as I mentioned, I mean this concept of our, our oneness, our connectedness. That's really what I consider to be the basis of spirituality, recognizing an existence beyond the material form that we, see, and a connection to all living things. And as we begin to uncover certain scientific dilemmas that have been around for a while, as quantum physics becomes more and more the framework for how we view the universe, what's happening is through quantum physics, many researchers and scientists are finding that indeed we are all interconnected. Indeed, we are creating the things around us. As they see these subatomic particles and quarks and bosons and whatnot, and that they respond to the energy of our thinking, they start to begin to fashion this idea of how interconnected we are. And as perhaps the most important discovery, I think, is the God particle, the so-called God particle, which is basically, in scientific terms, it's called the Higgs boson particle, and it was a theory for decades, almost as long as I've been alive, and finally, scientists are comfortable with saying that it actually exists, and basically, what Higgs boson is supposedly does is to it's that which connects everything together, which changes energy into matter, so forth and so on. And I've done a number of shows on it. If you want to go back and listen to those, which went into the quantum physics aspect of it, in more detail, feel free to go do that. But I'm just going to kind of bottom line it there. So as that is discovered, again, we find out that there is this